So the other side of the coin is what was happening in the US during the same time period of the first third of the 19th century. And what was happening with the US was the US was expanding. This is a map, and in yellow, you can see all the parts of the world that Spain had possession over or claim over at the beginning of the 19th century. With regard to what becomes the United States, you can see Florida, Louisiana, and the rest of the Southwest. These are some of the main things I'll be emphasizing, talking about. All right, the Louisiana Purchase. Now, you may be aware that the Louisiana Purchase was bought from France in 1803. And typically, so yeah, that's typically how we talk about it. It's in 1803, the US bought the Louisiana Purchase from France for $15 million. And then from that, we get the Lewis and Clark expedition, where they go out to map out this newly acquired territory. And then, we also get the stories of Sacagawea from that. Now, a Spanish American perspective of this would be a little different, would be that Spain controlled that territory of Louisiana for the most part. France had only acquired it a year before they sold it. And they acquired it again because they had taken over Spain itself and gotten rid of the Spanish king. And when the Lewis and Clark expedition sets out to kind of create maps of this newly acquired territory, they ended up demonstrating US interest in not only this newly acquired territory, because they didn't limit themselves to just mapping out the newly acquired territory. They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so that demonstrated that the US, wanted to have better maps and knowledge of, because of their interest in going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just the adding of some land to the United States. It doubled the size of the United States. So it wasn't just a purchase. I mean, it was a huge thing, again, because it doubled the size of the United States. Then there's the War of 1812. I mentioned before, and kind of the traditional way in which we learn about the War of 1812 is in 1812, there was the impressment of US sailors off of New England. And so, we had to fight against England to show them, they weren't going to take us back. They weren't going to push us around, and it's about positioning ourselves as if we're not the victims, but we're the ones defending ourselves from these things that the British are doing to our citizens. And impressing US sailors means that the British would arrest sailors and then force them to work in the British Navy. And so yeah, that we're told that's the reason for this war. And the result of it is, we show the British they're not going to take us back. We're going to remain independent. And we get the Star-Spangled Banner out of it. and Andrew Jackson gets recognized as a war hero. Those are kind of some of the things we were told about this war. What we're typically not told about this war is that it was a war for US expansion. We were fighting against the British not because they were impressing sailors, not for the reason that the public was told, that they were impressing sailors off the coast of New England. It's because we wanted to expand our territory into British Canada and into the Native American South. And that is why the overwhelming majority of the fighting happened, kind of in the Great Lakes area against British Canada. Why we went into, I think it was Ontario was it Ontario? Ontario or Toronto? Ontario. We bombed their capital of Ontario. And also, even though we call it the War of 1812, it was a war that started in 1812, officially, I think, went on to 1814, unofficially all the way into 1815. And so yeah, we did most of the fighting out west in what today we call the Midwest or the South, in the kind of Great Lakes area against the British, although there were also their Native American allies. And in the South, it was primarily against Native Americans. And it's because of our invading of Canada, bombing of their capital of Ontario, that the British retaliate and burn down Washington, D.C. in 1814. And so again, this idea that stereotypes tend to serve a purpose today, sort of whatever time we use stereotypes, they serve a purpose. It helps to justify some policy or some war or whatever. Similar with wars, we're kind of told what to remember. I'll get more to that and give more examples of that later. But, that relates to the Alamo because, how many of you have heard the expression, remember the Alamo? How many of you have ever heard of the burning down of Washington, D.C.? Yeah. And so, a much smaller number, maybe like 20, 25% of you, as opposed to like 80, 90% for the Alamo. And so yeah, those are aspects of that war that we're not told about. Then we get to 1819 in Florida and the Adams-Onís Treaty. This has to do with this concept of filibusters. For this class, when I'm talking about filibusters, I'm talking about this definition. It's when, well, here we're talking about US citizens, that they're US citizens who would go to a territory, a fort, a region, a port, an island, some territory that doesn't belong to the United States. They would show up with an armed group, and it was, they were not doing it as representatives of the United States. They were doing it kind of out of their own, I don't know, for their own interests. So they would show up to places in particular that belong to the United States. I'm sorry, that belong to Spain or later after that, Mexico. And so in this case, they show up to Florida and they take over islands, they take over northern Florida, they take over forts. They show up and they say, you are now free and independent. We bring you freedom and independence, and we're going to be in charge. And then after they take over, then later on the US would annex them. And so this was the annex them officially into the United States. And this is a process that happened many times. In Florida, for example, it happened in 1810, in 1813, and 1814. Then you read in Gonzales how when the US and Spain signed the Adams-Onís Treaty, where the United States is given Florida by Spain. Gonzales refers to it as being more similar to a street corner holdup, than an agreement or a treaty, because the US had already militarily taken over much of Florida when they signed this agreement with Spain. And again, at this point, Spain was fighting against Mexico, who was fighting for their independence. And in exchange, this is another thing we don't learn about. What does Spain get out of this? Why does Spain agree to this? Well, they're fighting against, they're busy with other wars where parts of their territory is trying to become independent. But they also have the United States agree that they're not going to help Latin American countries get their independence. And in this case, specifically Mexico. And so yeah, all things about this that we're not taught about. And the Adams-Onís Treaty is also referred to as a transcontinental treaty. Because Spain gave up its claims to the Northwest. And so then after that, it's just the US and Britain that still have claim to it. All right. Then we get to the Monroe Doctrine. Well, actually, let me finish this up. With filibusters, so I talked about the ones in Florida. Then there were 5 filibustering attempts in Texas from 1801 to 1819. And the one in 1836 is the one that ends up being successful, where there were US citizens who show up armed and they try to take over a piece of land that doesn't belong to the country they're citizens of. And they say, we bring you freedom and independence, and we're going to be in charge. And then the one in 1836 ends up being successful. And that's why Texas becomes its own country, because it wasn't officially the United States that was doing it. And so Texas becomes an independent country before it's annexed. Eventually, we end up trying to do it in Nicaragua as well. And in Gonzales, you can see a long list of different filibustering expeditions. All right, the Monroe Doctrine is when in 1823, the United States, James Monroe says, to the world that the US is no longer going to allow European countries to continue to colonize the Americas. And so outwardly, it's this idea of, it's like it's a period of independence now. The days of European colonization are over. But in reality, there's a number of issues there. One is that we didn't have the means to enforce it. And from the very start, we started making exceptions for coming to agreements with the British, allowing them to continue to colonize parts of the Americas, like Belize or Jamaica and so forth in Middle America, which you're not familiar with, but it's essentially like Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And, the subtext is also that, the reason we're outwardly saying we're not going to let you do this anymore is because we're claiming it for ourselves. It's our backyard, and we want to control the Americas. We don't want European countries to do that. And so, despite the Monroe Doctrine, there were at least a half dozen examples where European countries continued to try to colonize and take over parts of Latin America, and the US did not try to stop them because of the Monroe Doctrine, as it had stated. Then we also, this is a little bit tangential, but so big and important, I can't omit it. And so that is the removal of Native Americans from what we call the South today, geographically, the US Southeast, where we have these Native American tribes. Sometimes, and you learn this in Gonzales, these tribes are remembered as, or they would refer to them as the civilized tribes. And this is because these tribes, and the Seminoles more than any, had a long history of contact with the Spanish. And so in that sense, they had been somewhat Europeanized. And so they, they're large tribes that had, just learned a lot of European ways about things. And these tribes did everything they could to prevent being forcefully removed from their traditional lands. We hear mostly about the Cherokee, although they weren't the only ones, and the Cherokee Trail of Tears, and I think part of the reason is that the Cherokee went to the greatest lengths to try to assimilate to US society, and it didn't save them from the same treatment. The Cherokee tried to emulate US government. They had a Supreme Court, separation of powers, democracy. They wrote their they had a written language. They tried to assimilate as best they could while still remaining Cherokee. They replicated US government, democracy, culture as best they could. Being in the South, there were even Cherokees who, trying to fit into the South, owned Black slaves, people of African descent. And none of that spared them, was enough to spare them from a forceful removal, where they were told that if, we're gonna force, you need to move to these reservations. And we promise that if you move to these reservations, then we'll leave you alone. And then, of course, that didn't happen either. So yeah, these 5 tribes end up getting pushed west into this undesirable kind of region. Undesirable until later on we find oil and gold and other minerals that we want to mine, and so then we kick them out again. But despite the promises and treaties we signed with them. So that is the kind of a lot of the things leading toward in Mexico during the first third of the 19th century, a lot of the background of what was happening in the United States and how it was expanding during the first third of the 19th century, that brings them to clash in Texas in 1836. But There's no way I can cover all that with the time we have left. So instead of getting started and cutting it off, I'll save it for next class. Yeah, next class I'll talk all about this.